in the last couple of decades, the Enneagram has become integrated into the spiritual life of some of our Christian churches. It's used in Sunday school classes and men's and women's groups and youth groups, even in sermons sometimes. And I've seen it used not just for staff evaluations, but as part of the application process to get a job. And when something worldly begins to become that integrated into our church life, I just think it's a good idea to evaluate whether or not it's appropriate. Hello and welcome to our latest episode of Thomas Takes. I'm Shawn Thomas, and this show encourages a bit more topical discussion, so I'm going to be sharing my take on certain things, and I hope that you will share yours as well in the comments, maybe take the discussion a little bit further. Thomas Takes is a supporter-only broadcast. Thank you so much for your continued support. Tonight's topic, this is a good one, y'all, is the Enneagram. Should Christians use it? And this is my take. All right, tonight's topic is a big one, and I don't want to rush through it. So as I was preparing for this episode, I realized to get it all in, I really needed to split it into two parts. So we're going to start tonight with part one, and then next month on March 7th, we'll finish it up with part two. And actually, I kind of like how that works out because we have a little more time to kind of chew on some of these thoughts, and I really would like to hear your take as well. So be sure to share your thoughts with the folks and other folks as well in the comments. I think it's important to share with you sometimes that where I'm coming from when I start to talk about some of these topics. And so before we get too far into this, I'm kind of like full disclosure here, but the truth is we all have our own filters through which we see and we understand everything. And with this topic, there's no question that I have a preset filter. So I'm just letting you know that right up front. When I was, I think, a sophomore or a junior in high school, one of my required courses was sociology. And I hated it. And the reason I hated it was because the way my brain thinks and functions is that my default is to always assume there is an exception to the rule. And it's pretty much impossible to categorize or summarize anything in this world without making an error or creating a flawed stereotype of some kind. And that's not to say that I don't think people in general or groups of people don't have certain shared characteristics that can be identified and even considered as, the norm. But in my mind, there's always an accounting for the so-called outlier. And with that, I kind of have this understanding that sometimes the outliers aren't necessarily the small minority. And that kind of thinking pretty much just flies in the face of sociological principles. So just for sociology for a second, I think a pretty good accepted definition of sociology is that it's the study of human behavior within a society. And actually what I would say is that it should say it's the attempted study of human behavior and the consequences of those behaviors. And so some examples of sociology include things like studying racial issues, gender dynamics, feelings around entertainment and the structure of different social institutions, the development of different social movements. And by study, what they really mean is that they assume to begin with that they can simply observe a predefined group of people and then come up with a concrete list of traits and behaviors and even beliefs, and then from those predict behavior and even claim to have a better understanding of how people tick. I just think that's crazy to think that as humans, we can even begin to have that kind of understanding about ourselves or our nature. And like I say, sometimes stereotypes fit, and I get that, and I don't see anything wrong with recognizing commonalities, but to base predictions of behavior or assume an understanding of behavior based on those kinds of stereotypes, I think that's approaching delusions of grandeur. I mean, God is God. We are not, right? So, needless to say, I did not do very well in my high school sociology class. And I share all that with you again because tonight's topic is on the Enneagram, which to me is an exercise in sociology. So obviously, I'm going to be skeptical before we even get out of the gate. But my intention here is to focus on whether or not the Enneagram is something that Christians should use. And so I'm going to focus on and share the research I found around that aspect of it. And you might even be asking, why am I asking this question in the first place? Whether or not the Enneagram should be used by Christians. And the reason is because I'm not just talking about an individual using it, because in the last couple of decades, the Enneagram has become integrated into the spiritual life of some of our Christian churches. It's used in Sunday school classes and men's and women's groups and youth groups, even in sermons sometimes. And I've seen it used not just for staff evaluations, but as part of the application process to get a job. And when something worldly begins to become that integrated into our church life, I just think it's a good idea to evaluate whether or not it's appropriate. So the next thing we need to do before we go any further is to define what the Enneagram is. And for some of you, this may be the first time you're even hearing about it. Others of you may know way more about this than me. All I ask is I'm going to do my best to try to leave out my biases and share that are based on my color filter of sociology as it is. And so if you are someone who uses or has used the Enneagram and you enjoy it and you found it beneficial, that you also try your best to keep in mind that in this discussion, I'm talking about the use of the Enneagram in our churches and in our congregations, and not personal individual use based on one's own personal discernment. Another quick note is that I'm sharing information here that I have found through research. And so I'm going to share my sources in the show notes if you'd like to learn more. And I'm not plagiarizing any of this. I'm just did some research, and so I'm sharing that with you. The Enneagram is, if we talk about just the basic definition, it's what it is. It's a categorization tool that classifies human personality into a typology of 9 interconnected personality traits or types. I see comparisons, people will say it's kind of like the Myers-Briggs personality type test, which again, that test is based in sociology too. And I know I wasn't going to go there, but I'm just pointing that out. And it's a tool to help determine a person's personality type. And there's 9 different personality types in this. And the symbol for the Enneagram and its 9 personality types looks like this, which honestly is a little unsettling in itself. And we'll talk some more about that here in a minute. All right, so each one of these personality types, they have a name. I know you probably can't read that from there, but they have names like the helper or the achiever or the peacemaker or the individualist. And then on top of that, all of these, they call them the primary types. They have adjacent types that are called wings, just to cover anything that doesn't fit the original diagnosed personality type. So you could have a type 2, they're doing that by the numbers. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then each one has their name associated with the number. So you could have, this is kind of their language that use the Enneagram, you could have a type 2 personality with a wing of a type 3 or something like that. And so it kind of reminds me of going into a fortune teller and they start talking to you and say something about your brother and you're like, well, I don't have a brother. And they're, oh yes, I misread. What I really meant was your sister is what I meant. And in this case, you might get categorized as a certain personality type and then say, well, that part doesn't fit me at all. And then they can say, or you can tell yourself, oh, well, that means you just must have this other adjacent personality type as a wing. And so that covers the part that doesn't fit. So where did the Enneagram even come from? And this is interesting. There's a bunch of claims out there, very ancient origins, and that's never been substantiated. But what can be shown is that the first mentions of the Enneagram in writings were of occultists who used it as a symbol of the universe. So just the shape, that was supposed to be the symbol of the universe. And then there was a psychiatrist named Claudio Naranjo, who was also an occultist. And he was the first to connect the 9 points of the Enneagram to 9 personality types. And then in the 1970s, students of that same person, Naranjo, spread the Enneagram to various Catholic communities. So that's kind of where it bled into the church. And that kind of was the creation of or gave it more credibility. And it created something called the Enneagram Institute, which helped bring it to a broader audience, as well as some writings of a Franciscan friar whose name was Richard Rohr. And if you are familiar with the Enneagram, you'll probably recognize his name. So in recent years, the Enneagram has grown in popularity within the evangelical and the Protestant churches. Now, those who favor the Enneagram in these churches tend to be younger, and here we are about to categorize and stereotype, but they tend to be younger, and they either don't know or they downplay the history of the Enneagram because they just consider it to be another kind of personality test. Now, those who oppose it tend to be older, and they associate the Enneagram with the occult because they're likely to have first seen books on the Enneagram in the New Age section of bookstores. And I can remember this myself. Now if you looked it up at a bookstore, or if you just looked it up online, it's probably going to be categorized in self-help or in the psychology section. But it used to be part of the New Age kind of feel of all these different kinds of things. And so the symbol is, as you see, and that's what I was mentioning earlier, it's kind of reminiscent of a pentagram, which is associated with various occult groups from Wiccans to Satanists. So that kind of sets the table for us to be able to move into this question: should Christians use the Enneagram? And that is where we will start next month's episode. I'm sorry about the cliffhanger. But like I said, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't rush through this topic. So I think tonight was a really good way to just kind of set up a foundation, talk about the history, the definition. I'm being honest about my own biases and filters about things and how I see things. And then next month, we'll dive in with both feet and really get into the question of, should Christians use the Enneagram? And I'll share some more of the research that I found with you. So that's my take for part 1. Thank you for letting me share. And I really do hope that you will share your thoughts and any ideas that you have, maybe even some information that you have. Feel free to share some links and some research that you know about in the comments. And we will see you then next month, the first Thursday, for part 2 of our discussion on the Enneagram. God bless.